It's always a journey of excitement, shall we call it, to figure out what it is we're going to discuss from week to week here on this channel. And today, what I have for you is that um, the subject of contradictions. It's something that comes up very often in my kind of a sphere where I'm defending apologetics and talking with atheists, secularists, Muslims, different people like this, and they're challenging the authenticity or the reliability of the Christian text, the New Testament or the Old Testament, or their ability to be compatible to one another on the basis of what they call contradictions in the text. And they always throw out all kinds of stuff. And so, before we even get started with any of that, let's first off talk about what a contradiction is. So, literally, contra against, diction or dictum is speech, to speak against. And so, in its virginal form, a contradiction is a statement of facts designed or intended to relate a convergent or a kind of a disagreeing narrative for the purpose of a divergent outcome. Now, that's a pretty technical definition, but basically, if you imagine like probably the single most critical moment, maybe in the in my generation, is September 11th, 2001. And so if you have an instance in which you were to ask four different people to describe what they seen, just anybody that was alive at the time, if they were to describe that date in time, and you were to say, let's say, a person living in New York City, and then a person who was living in California at the time, like me, and then you got somebody who just happened to be on a commercial flight from anywhere to anywhere during that day, not near the Northeast, just on a commercial flight anywhere. And then fourth, let's say I don't know, somebody who lived in Pennsylvania. Okay, four different people. Asked them what happened on 9/11. They would relate to you their experience of the event. So for me, living in California, I heard about it on the radio first in the morning, and then switched on the TV, and I saw the plane hit the second tower and both of the towers collapse. I saw those three things. The reason I was able to see those things was that TV cameras were already on site to record the second plane hit and the towers collapse. Now, if I couldn't relay information, eyewitness testimony, or if I wasn't able to relay information about a first plane hitting the tower, does that mean it did not happen? No, that's not what that means. What it means is I didn't experience that part of it because I didn't have access to the information necessary to have done so. Okay? Now, if you have someone who lived in New York City, especially someone who lived or worked in Manhattan, their experience of 9/11, very different. Maybe they actually did see the first plane hit. Maybe they did, in fact, actually maybe they're a first responder and they went and just like helped with the recovery or like things like that. Maybe they did, and so their experience would be remarkably different. If, however, you were to speak to a journalist maybe that was covering that day, you would get a different account of it. Maybe that they would talk more about the emotional impact, or somebody that would talk about the efforts of recovering and clearing out the rubble and things like that. Maybe you'd get a story like that out of it. If you ask somebody who was just on a commercial flight, you'd probably get a story of someone who's confused and frustrated because they're having their plane grounded unexpectedly, maybe being stranded in a faraway place where they are not able to get in contact with loved ones. Remember, cell phones were not as common as they are now, especially not HD video type, or internet accessible type. And so it was a very different world, for just laying that down. People being like, imagine all the people that are trying to get a hold of loved ones, knowing that they were on planes and not being able to because the cellular networks are overloaded. That's a consistent problem that is faced often in emergency circumstances. And so you have the fear and the anxiety of not being able to get a hold of this loved one. Like, you could get very different and very, like, all of which are valid and true to that individual's experience. But they wouldn't necessarily cohere to a specific data set. The person who's just trying to get a hold of their loved one on a plane, they just know that there's been a crash somewhere, maybe 2 or 3 planes, maybe the Northeast, but you don't know because information is sketchy, right? We face this all the time. So, when we're talking about the 4 resurrection accounts, when we're talking about the ascension accounts, when we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, or we're talking about these kind of things, having different accounts that show maybe a different ordering in information, or you have different accountings of people present, that's actually cohesive to telling the story. It's not divergent. It doesn't say, this is not a contradiction, it's just a variance in detail. And that's really important to recognize. You encounter this in law enforcement investigations, you encounter this in journalism, this is what you expect to find. It does not undermine the story. All right, so that's one really critical type of supposed contradiction. The next kind involves names, dates, or accounting of numbers. All right. For instance, one that's really important that comes up a lot is the convergence of the names of Quirinius and Herod around the birth of Jesus. And this is a really interesting, challenging issue because it involves dating, and not like the kissy face kind. Dating as far as finding out when events happened in history. And if you didn't know this, we subscribe to what's called the Gregorian calendar. It's solar based, and it is the standard now kind of across the world because of everyone being on the same time basis and things in order to do commerce. And it's been this way for more than 1,000 years. No one you have ever met has ever lived on a different calendaring system unless they're doing like the Hebrew lunar calendar to figure out when to do their celebrations. Or the Muslims as well, they use a lunar calendar to figure out when to do their different holidays. But one of the things about this is that it's a later introduction to human dating. Like, basically, it's a few hundred years old, almost 1,000 years old, basically around 1,000 years old. But it was not around at the time when these events were being recorded, and it was not around at the time when these events were occurring either. And this has been a significant problem for historians and archaeologists throughout the modern age of figuring out when to put the pins into the timeline of events, because simply throughout most of history, especially the BC era, when a new leader took office or they conquered a nation or whatever, they would rewrite the timeline to start in the year 1 of this person's reign. And so you have to try and figure out how those things fit together, because Persia and the Medes and the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Greeks and all these, they were using that same timing system. But of course, this ruler did not take the throne at the same time as theirs. And so you have year one of this person's reign is not year one necessarily of that person's reign. And you have to, like, when did this happen? And it's been difficult. And so you have possible variants of up to decades or even centuries of when an event occurred, because simply we don't have necessarily the information we need to put things in the correct order at the right time. And one critical instance of this is the date of Herod's death. The Greek characters for 1 and 4, rather than being like ours, which are very different or fairly different, are actually fairly similar. And if you, in the copies of Josephus that record the history of that time, record Herod's death, the character there, it could be a 4, it could be a 1, we don't know. But most copies have it footnoted of that it could have been 1, it could have been 4. And so putting the actual birth of Christ, obviously it wasn't in year 0 because that didn't exist. And it didn't actually occur in AD 1 because that time scale didn't exist either. So we have to figure it out and fit it in. And it's very difficult. That's what I'm getting at. And so as far as dating of when this event happened or that event happened, as long as it's in the right sequence of this and then that, we're fine. We can follow it along. But as far as when it occurred precisely, that's a harder question to answer. All right. The next thing is about those numbers. Numbers of currency, numbers of soldiers, numbers of armies, number of population counts, things like that. What about those? Well, this also is something we don't have the necessary information to verify, because we don't know who precisely is counting, what their method of counting is, who they are counting up, like who it is that is being counted, and then number 4, the reason that it is being counted. Why does that matter? If you were to ask different people in the military kind of institutions that we have, how many people we have in the military, if you ask the Joint Chiefs of the Army and the Air Force, you're going to get different numbers. Because the Army is going to count a different category, or they're going to use a different criteria for determining how many standing soldiers or whatever that we have than someone in the Air Force, because they're going to want to count their pilots and UAVs and things like that. Army's not going to want to do that. And if you've been around veterans at all, you know that they don't necessarily consider the same thing to be a soldier or a fighting man. Same thing in the Navy, and same thing in the Marine Corps. Like, if depending on who you ask, you will get a different number. Standing available soldiers, whether or not they count the guardsmen, whether they count reservists, whether they count active being deployed and in place, or if they just have enlisted in general, including those on leave. Like, depending on who you ask, you could get a number that varies in the hundreds of thousands potentially. So, which one's right? The answer is yes, according to their own criteria. And if you ask them, you press, this happens as well, you pull up the bureau, like anytime someone's talking about the number of people of unemployed, the number of people who have lost their businesses in 2020, the number of small business owners in general, depending on the criteria in which that question is framed, you will get very different answers. And Pew and Barna and organizations like that that are professionals in terms of counting people, counting heads, they usually will spend several chapters in the beginning of a study dedicated to, these are the questions we asked, these are the criteria we looked for, these are the criteria of individuals, how we classified who is responding, age range, religious affiliations, social organizations, blah, 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 blah. Very, very fine detail as far as what they're asking, because we know that in the future, if we want to reference this information again, We need that kind of precision. Ancient cultures just didn't. And even if they did, even if Egypt or somebody else had kept fine detailed counts of all these things, a lot of it's been lost. And also keep in mind, we don't know who's this stuff being written for. And that simply the people that were originally going to be reading those numbers are not us. And so there's a lot of without being said information clearly implied. We don't have necessarily the context necessary in order to really comprehend what this number is and what it means and why. Let's say if in Samuel or Chronicles they diverge from one another, because again, we don't know who is counting, we don't know what was being counted. So in the instance, let's use a really precise example. In 2 Samuel and 2 Chronicles, there is a story in which it talks about the number of fighting men available, and it says men who drew the sword. And in one it says 1.1 million, and the other it says 800,000. That's a 300,000 per man difference. Why would this be? It says they drew the sword, right? That means they were all swordsmen. We'll slow the roll. Because, first, Israel has never really been rich, and swords are expensive. So arming an entire nation's fighting force with swords at that time, pretty unlikely. And so what would have probably been more likely is that they would have had spears. Spears were the standard accoutrement of fighting forces throughout the ancient world, because the only part that needs to be metal is the head, and you can make hundreds of thousands potentially of spearheads with the same materials it takes to make a few swords. So wooden shaft, boom, you can arm an entire nation of militia with just this one polearm. And additionally, polearms are a lot easier to teach someone who is inexperienced in combat how to use, because especially if you have people like shepherds that are used to using staves and things to ward off, or they're used to using ox goads for driving animals and things, they'll be much more comfortable with this kind of a weapon than with a sword. You have to spend years training with a sword. So it's possible that the difference here is between standing armies with a sword and then those who are prepared as well with inferior equipment that just could be called upon. Again, we just don't know. We can make lots of assumptions to insert in there, but we just don't know. So is this really a contradiction? You don't have the facts necessary to say that it is, and I don't have necessarily the facts to say that it's not, but there are a lot of things in there to suggest that it isn't one. So that on its own, those different categories deal with or kind of defeat most of what is described as a contradiction in a kind of case-by-case basis. And I would encourage you that if you're interested in these things, go in deep and study them. There's nothing to be scared of in it. And even go to those atheist websites that list them, find out what they say, and do the research. Look into them. Give them an honest shake and see what's there. And simply, I don't think that you will you have anything to fear about them.